So, good morning, everybody. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Atlantic Council Front Page. This is our premier virtual platform for global leaders. And we have a global leader with us today. It's my particular pleasure to welcome you all because our guest of honor is General David Petraeus, who is going to talk about the themes of his new book, Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare, from 1945 to Ukraine. It's a penetrating and incredibly well-written analysis of what we need to learn from past warfare and also what we have to anticipate about the future. He wrote it with the acclaimed British historian Andrew Roberts, and if ever there were a dynamic duo of military practice and history, it is these two authors. So first and foremost, buy the book, read the book. General Petraeus served as director of the CIA following 37 years in the United States Army. His last military assignments were as commander of International Security Force in Afghanistan and 10th commander of the U.S. Central Command, and as commanding general multinational force Iraq, where he oversaw all coalition forces in Iraq and also the surge. And I think it's going to be very interesting to hear him as well on Gaza, although this happened after the book was complete. I'm also incredibly proud to say that General Petraeus is a board member of the Atlantic Council, and he's also the recipient of our highest honor for military leaders, the Atlantic Council Distinguished Military Leadership Award. General Petraeus, some of us believe we're facing the greatest threat to global order since the 1930s, and we all know what happened at the end of the 1930s with Putin's war in Ukraine, Hamas terrorist attack in Israel, and the ensuing war and tensions around China and Taiwan. Today's discussion will reflect on the development of warfare since the end of World War II, while exploring what the wars in Ukraine and Gaza portend for modern warfare. Our conversation today is hosted by the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, which develops sustained nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners, and it honors the legacy of General Brent Scowcroft. To guide us, we're honored and grateful to be joined by PBS NewsHour's Ali Rogan, who will moderate this discussion. So thank you both for joining us, General Petraeus and Ali, and over to you.
Fred, thank you so much. General Petraeus, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Any single conflict that we're going to be talking about today would rightly deserve to dominate the headlines every single day, and of course warrant rigorous analysis from experts like you. But of course, we're witnessing several massive conflicts and potential conflicts simultaneously. As Fred mentioned, there's Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There's Hamas's attack on Israel, and now Israel's war in Gaza in retaliation. And there's a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. General, my first question to you is, how do you assess the current threat environment? And why is it important, as you did in your book, to look to recent as well as older history for lessons on modern warfare?
Well, first of all, great to be back with the Atlantic Council. As always, thanks for the kind introduction and invitation. Fred and Ali, thanks for guiding this conversation. I think that we face today in the world the greatest number of threats and the most complex array of threats since the end of World War II. If you think of the U.S. as the guy in the circus who has to keep a lot of different plates spinning, I think there are more plates in that tent right now, and some that are more challenging than we've seen at any time since, again, the end of World War II. Certainly, we have allies and partners who help us keep those plates spinning, but the sheer array of those and the responses that we have to take, the preparation that we have to undergo to be able to address all of them, because they're all up and down the spectrum of conflict, is very considerable. There's obviously the biggest of the plates you alluded to. This has to do with the U.S. and the Western relationship with China. That plate is bigger than all the others in the tent put together. We and the rest of the world keep trying to focus on the Indo-Pacific, but then we keep getting drawn back into the Middle East or into Europe or into other challenges elsewhere. But that's the main effort. Deterrence there is above all the most important mission, not just for the U.S. military, not just for the entire U.S. government, but really for the U.S. and all of our allies and partners around the world, because were deterrence to break down into conflict there, the results would be catastrophic indeed for the entire world. But there's still obviously a Russia plate, and that has erupted into conflict with the brutal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. We have responded, I think, quite impressively there, albeit often with some decisions that could have been made more expeditiously. But the US and NATO and Western response to that has been really very substantial. I think far more substantial, probably, than Vladimir Putin thought. And that's a lesson, because we probably took actions in the past that led him to believe that perhaps we would not respond as substantially as we have. Then you obviously have the situation with this barbaric, horrific, unspeakable attack by Hamas on Israel that is in one day not only brought about terrible loss of life in the way in which it was done, and even videoed and uploaded to show the world the unspeakable actions, but then invalidated in one day the entire Israeli approach to Gaza and Hamas, showing that they should be regarded as the Islamic State, if you will, albeit with some Palestinian nationalism associated with that. In other words, an organization that is an extremist Islamist organization, terrorist army that has to be destroyed and cannot be deterred or reconciled, or you cannot mow the grass every few years and enjoy a reduced period of activity before you have to do that again. So you have that ongoing as well, but there are still Islamist extremist groups elsewhere around the world, individual plates that have to be kept spinning. You have to keep an eye and pressure on them. We learned after the withdrawal of our combat forces from Iraq, and then the Iraqi security forces took their eye off what had become the Islamic State, defeated, destroyed during the surge as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, able to reconstitute and establish the first ever caliphate in Iraq and northeastern Syria. There are a variety of other threats out there, various cyber threats of various types. There's Iran with its nuclear program plate. There is an Iranian proxy plate, Shia militias, of course, in Iraq, Hezbollah, Hamas, not Shia in that case, Sunni, but also the Houthis. And then there's just the Iranian threat itself in terms of its very substantial arsenal now of missiles and rockets with longer range, larger payloads, and greater accuracy. And there are more. Obviously, there are those that are associated with various aspects of climate change, desertification, very substantial migration, illegal migration in many cases that cause security issues. So again, when you look at this tent and the array of plates in it, and the challenges that they represent, I think it's accurate to say what you did at the outset, that this is the period of the greatest number of challenges and the greatest complexity of challenges. And you said the 1930s. I might actually say at least the end of World War II.
General, your book, which is Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, is both sweeping in terms of the context that you provide and very specific and prescriptive in terms of looking at each individual conflict. What are the key themes of the book, and what are the key ways in which warfare has changed since 1945, and in what ways has it stayed the same?
Well, I think the biggest of the big ideas is actually that which has to do with the critical importance of strategic leadership. That is leadership at the very top. It's the most senior civilian official, typically President of the United States, Prime Minister of the UK, in the conflicts that we look at, but also that in our adversaries, of course, as well. So in Hanoi, not just Washington. And then it's the senior battlefield commander, the commander of the theater of war. And they have to perform 4 tasks superbly if their side is to have a reasonable prospect of prevailing. And those 4 tasks are to get the big ideas right, to understand the context, the strategic, the nature of the war, the various aspects and elements of it, and to understand that in a very granular manner so that you can craft the right strategy, you can get the right big ideas. They then have to be communicated effectively throughout the breadth and depth of the organization and to all other individuals who have a stake in the outcome of the conflict. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. This is the example that the leader provides, the energy, the inspiration. It's how the leader spends his or her time, because that is how you drive a campaign plan. It's the meetings you have with the different organizations and leaders underneath the strategic leader. It's how the leader sees for him or herself going out and going on patrol, as we used to, at least twice a week during the surge in Iraq, as an example. It's the metrics that you use. And they have to be the right metrics. The body count in Vietnam was not only the wrong metric, then it became an increasingly dishonest metric. Frankly, it became corrupted. There was a degree of integrity that was missing over time in the reporting of that. And then there's a fourth task that should be on that battle rhythm. It has to be on your calendar. You have to force yourself to do it, which is to sit down formally and determine how you need to refine the big ideas as the strategic context evolves, so that you can perform the process again and again and again. And this is something we come back to. In fact, we went through all these conflicts, we did all the chapters, and we said, we have to sharpen our discussion of that. I should just note that this intellectual construct for strategic leadership is something that I developed between the 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq, used it explicitly starting with the surge in Iraq, then also at Central Command in Afghanistan and at the CIA. It's valid in the civilian world and the business world, where I've been for the last 10 years as well, and it is absolutely central. Another very big idea that should be taken from the book is that what happens in one part of the world reverberates in other parts. And I think we have seen examples of that just in the last decade or so. If you have a red line that is not a red line, that actually reverberates in other parts of the world. If you don't respond as firmly as you might have in some case, again, that can give people an idea that you might respond firmly if they take action as well. The decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, you can debate that all you want, and I would. I think that we had alternatives. I thought that that was a sustainable commitment, however frustrating and maddening and difficult it was. But that the decision to withdraw of this administration to follow through with what the previous administration agreed with the Taliban sent a message to Moscow. It also sent a message to Beijing. In fact, President Xi seized on it, and he said, see, you cannot count on the Americans. They're undependable allies and partners. And look how that withdrawal went. They're also a great power in decline. But again, they looked at a situation. If we couldn't even maintain 3,500 troops on the ground, the cost in blood was very minimal. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months prior to the beginning of the withdrawal and the tragic suicide bombing at the airfield. And it was costing us 25 billion or so out of a defense budget of more than 800 billion. So again, what happens in one place, what you do in one region can have an impact on deterrence and on perceptions in other regions. And keep in mind that deterrence is a function of two elements. It's a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand. So we always have to be transforming them and ensuring them that they are more than adequate for the particular task that might have to be performed. And then the willingness to employ them on the other hand. And you have to ensure that there's no doubt about that without being needlessly provocative. So again, firm, but not needlessly provocative. So those are, I think, the two big takeaways. Beyond that, we have seen clearly the evolution of warfare in a variety of different ways. In my period in particular of the wars of the post 9/11 period, where we saw the advent of unmanned systems, that really was quite transformative. We've also seen at various points the rise of anti-tank guided missiles. The Yom Kippur War, the lesson of the first few days was, my gosh, the tank is its day has passed. And then within a few days, the brilliant response by the Israelis, after having been surprised very, very substantially by the Egyptians, and Ariel Sharon leads the counterattack and traps the Third Egyptian Army and is on the road to Cairo with tanks by the end of that war. But we see that go back and forth. And then you actually see what is really quite an extraordinary war in Ukraine, a tragic, brutal, unprovoked invasion, to be sure. But what Max Boot, I think, has beautifully characterized as the war in which All Quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner, because you have all the way back to World War I style trenches, barbed wire, very substantial minefields that actually double the density even that their doctrine calls for. Again, exceedingly formidable for the Ukrainian forces, especially given that they don't have any air power to speak of. Tanks arrived late, didn't get lots of breaching systems and so forth. But then you also have right on top of those minefields, on top of those World War I defenses, quite modern drones that bring very substantial quantities of artillery to bear very quickly with a sensor to shooter link that has been shortened very impressively on both sides, I should add. Um, and then this is all taking place with Cold War equipment. You know, when I was a major brigade operations officer back in the Cold War years in the inter-German border, we had the very same tanks you see out there now. The US M1s have finally arrived, Abrams tanks, the Leopards on the German side, European countries. You see on the Russian side, T-62, 64s, 72s, 80s, and so forth. They were all there back then. Yes, there's some newer versions, although not anywhere near as many as we were led to believe by reports of the Russian modernization effort. And then finally, it's conducted in a context that is the most transparent in history, because everyone now on a battlefield, even more so, much more so than when I was commanding in Iraq and Afghanistan more than a decade ago, has a smartphone, internet access, and social media sites onto which they can upload various videos, photographs, statements, and so on, that again provide numerable sources of open source information that, when aggregated, can give you a picture of a war that until now just was never possible. So you have all of these developments, and again, interestingly, in Ukraine, you see quite a bit of this that is a throwback to the past, but also hints as to the future of warfare as well.
I'd like to pick up on the first point that you presented as a key pillar of leadership, successful leadership, whether it be in warfare, politics, domestic life, that leaders need to get the big ideas right. And I'd like to ask about how that applies to the leadership that we're seeing, or lack thereof, in Ukraine and Israel. First, in Ukraine, right now, there is a grinding counteroffensive taking place. And in Israel, you've commented that the big idea is certainly to destroy Hamas, but that you and Andrew Roberts have written that you hope that policymakers are also planning for the day after. So how does that big idea apply to what is currently happening in those two conflicts?
Well, these are central. And what we see in Ukraine is particularly interesting. You have a compare and contrast of two different strategic leaders. If you look at those at the very top, in the form of President Zelensky and then President Putin. Zelensky, despite a first 2 1/3 years in office that were not enormously distinguished, he was elected, of course, to carry out reforms. There was a modest degree of achievement, but has been, I think, a truly brilliant strategic leader as a wartime leader. He very much got the big ideas right. I mean, think of the first big idea is, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. I'm going to stay in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. We're going to defend Kyiv to the end. The entire country is going to mobilize, and all men are going to stay in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. So he's really been quite extraordinary. And again, these sound like very simple, obvious, commonsensical big ideas. They weren't. Remember, there were certain parties that were encouraging him to leave Kyiv and go to Lviv in the west and start planning about what you do after you lose all of Ukraine up to the Dnipro River, and figure out how to conduct an insurgency in response to it, rather than defending the capital. And of course, ultimately, they win the Battle of Kyiv, of Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Kherson, and so forth in the first year. Really quite extraordinary results for the Ukrainian side that Vladimir Putin obviously totally underestimated, as he also overestimated the capabilities of his forces, and probably quite clearly underestimated the response of the US, NATO countries, and the West. Zelensky's communication skills have been really quite positively Churchillian. And of course, Andrew Roberts, my co-author, Lord Roberts of Belgravia, now is the author of the best single volume biography of Churchill. And you see Zelensky employing the same communication skills, addressing the UK Parliament, the Bundestag, our Congress, the first wartime leader, in fact, to address both houses of Congress, again, while his country was at war. Since Churchill did back in World War II. And in each case, there was a differentiated message. It was appropriate, particular historical allusions to the country to whose legislature he was speaking, and so forth. His oversight of the implementation of the big ideas, his example, think of that. He takes off his suit and he puts on an OD sweatshirt with the Ukrainian forces logo on it. And he's had that on ever since. In fact, when Fred Kemp and I and others from the Atlantic Council met with him some months back, that was exactly what he was wearing. He stayed in Kiev, as I mentioned. He goes to the front lines. He's out with the soldiers. He pins on medals. He's giving nightly addresses to the people, and so on and so forth. And then there has been a degree of adaptation and so on. Putin, again, the exact opposite, got the big ideas wrong. As I said, underestimated the Ukrainians, overestimated his forces, terrible campaign design. His forces were also more attributable to the military leadership, but very poorly trained, much less well equipped than we thought. Basic skills were quite inadequate, and a variety of other shortcomings. Yeah, maybe he's communicated effectively the Russian people who are left, of course, noting that hundreds of thousands of them left early on and others have left since then, rather than to be subject to a draft. And then the oversight of what's his example? He sits at the end of a marble table in a beautiful suit, and the minions are down there. Yes, he occasionally has gone somewhere near the front lines, but again, nothing like Zelensky. But at the end of the day, despite the achievements of the Ukrainians in the first year, the Russian military has been a learning organization. They have established a very, very formidable defense that I described earlier in the South, even if the general who oversaw it, General Surovikin, has been fired by Putin, as have many of his other leaders. But so this is an uncertain outcome, and Russians still occupy 18% of Ukrainian soil. Ukrainian determination is still absolutely rock solid. I was just there 5 or 6 weeks ago and validated that, although the attitude, the climate is much more sober than it was when Fred and I and the Atlantic Council delegation were there 5 or more months ago. But that war is going to grind on, and we'll see if there can be a breakthrough by the acquisition or the provision of capabilities that General Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian military leader, has requested in an essay that was quite forthright, where he assessed in The Economist that this is now a stalemate. So if you turn to Israel, you're exactly right. What Andrew and I wrote was that we understand the biggest of the big ideas right now, but we think there need to be additional big ideas. And we felt that from the very beginning. The big idea here, of course, is that, as I mentioned earlier, if you conclude that Hamas is an extremist army, cannot be reconciled, can't be effectively that deterred, then you have to destroy them. And that's what they are bent on doing, and also dismantling the political wing of Hamas, enormous implications of that as well. In other words, Hamas is no longer going to be able to run the Gaza Strip and oversee the 2.3 or so million Palestinians who reside there. But as they go through this, we cannot envision a more difficult context than what does face the Israelis. They have made impressive gains so far, but you literally have to clear every building, every room, every cellar, every tunnel as you go along, and you have to hold them. This really should be thought of as more of a counterinsurgency campaign than a conventional military campaign. This is not the counterattack of the 1973 war out in the open desert, tank on tank, not that many civilians in the way. This is obviously a densely populated area, and even though they've been able to get many hundreds of thousands of civilians out of the way with their leaflets and text messages, there are still hundreds of thousands left, and that has to be dealt with. And so you need to be thinking at the outset about hearts and minds, a key tenet of counterinsurgency that traces the actual terminology back to Malaysia, and Sir Gerard Templer, the great British commander, was both a civil and the military commander in that particular case. And as you clear, you have to hold, and then you should rebuild. By the way, the uproar about going into a hospital, I find a little bit curious because when we did Fallujah for the last time, we did many large cities during the surge in Iraq, in particular. First against Sunni extremists, Al Qaeda in Iraq, Sunni insurgents, and then eventually in the second year, the Iranian supported Shia militia. And in the case of Fallujah, the final time that we did it, very deliberately, painstakingly, the very first objective was to secure the hospital. And we did that for several reasons. One was to ensure that it was not a source of disinformation about casualties, as it was in the past when it was hung onto, when it was held by the extremists until the very end. And then number two, to make sure it functioned. And I hope that the Israelis will continue to do what they did on the first day when they entered, which is they quite visibly brought in incubators and other medical supplies and so forth. Keep it operational, make it what right looks like, get a corridor that goes into it, and treat the innocent civilians that have been wounded, injured, and so forth in the course of this fighting. Also, obviously, identify any of the Hamas fighters that are going in there and then take them to secured medical facilities, as we did as well in the case of those Al Qaeda fighters and others that were wounded in our operations. But when you clear, hold, and build, that's a very big task because it means you cannot clear and move on. You have to retain control of the areas, or the enemy will re-infiltrate behind you, especially if they can do it through tunnels that may or may not have been identified. Keep in mind that there's an element of suicide bombers here that is particularly pernicious, a willingness on the part of some of those in the extremist ranks to blow themselves up to take Israeli soldiers with them, either vest bombs or car bombs. And that forces a particular degree of caution that can be very, very challenging for individual soldiers. But ultimately, I think they're also going to have to go to the south. And so here, I think it would be very, very valuable, very important if there was additional big ideas that life for the Palestinian people in Gaza will be vastly improved after Hamas is no longer part of it, and talk about what they're going to do in that regard and describe how, at least in the near term, they're going to provide for the people, even as they try to identify a competent, capable, and trustworthy Palestinian entity. That's what Secretary of State Blinken would like to see. We'd all like to see that. I'm not sure that that exists in the West Bank, much less willing to deploy to Gaza and be seen as arriving on the backs of Israeli tanks, or an Arab country delegation, or a UN transitional authority of some type. The problem with all of these, though, is that there's one mission that has to be performed in addition to the provision of humanitarian assistance, restoration of basic services, and oversight of reconstruction of the enormous amount of damage and destruction that is just to be expected. And we're seeing already in any urban conflict of the intensity that this is. That additional task is to ensure that Hamas cannot reconstitute. And again, we saw this happen with the Islamic State after our combat forces left Iraq and the Iraqis took their eye off it. A couple of years later, you have a caliphate. That cannot be allowed to happen here. The Israelis are very, very keenly aware of that. That's why I suspect Prime Minister Netanyahu suggested that Israeli forces might have to oversee security there at the very least, knowing that they don't want to do that. The U.S. is discouraging from doing that for obvious reasons. There's a reason they left in 2005, but you break it, you own it. Pottery barn rules or pottery house rules obtain here, that's a real conundrum. And so the sooner, I think, though, that even just the vision for the Palestinian people in Gaza, and by the way, this would also be the time to announce a vision for the Palestinian people in the West Bank as well. And inevitably, in my view, it does have to be a return to the two-state solution, given that there's absolutely no alternative to that.
Fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your insights, General Petraeus. I'm now going to turn to questions from the audience. First, from Jack Krupansky. He asks, how do you parse the role of diplomacy and foreign affairs relative to modern warfare? Should diplomacy focus on diffusing tension, averting conflict and resolving conflict, or focus more on facilitating warfare, such as arranging and facilitating military alliances?
Well, it's a great question, especially because I felt very, very strongly about the role of diplomats and diplomacy and associated entities under the country team, if you will, led by the great ambassadors with whom I was privileged to serve, especially Ambassador Ryan Crocker during the surge in Iraq. My great Marine comrade Jim Mattis captured this really well one time when he said, "If you don't give us diplomats, you're going to have to provide more ammunition." And so the answer to the question is really that it is all of the above. Obviously, you want in the beginning to avoid warfare, and in that role, the diplomacy that cobbles together the components of deterrence is very significant. It's crucial. If you look at the Indo-Pacific, the deterrence in the Indo-Pacific doesn't just rest on the military forces, it's on all of our capabilities. What we need there is a comprehensive, integrated, whole of governments with an S on the end approach to China. And by the S on the end means that it's our allies and partners together with the US. And of course, it's not just, again, military, it's also diplomatic, it's economic, it's trade, although there is a gap in our comprehensive approach to China when it comes to trade. We should have obviously joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we actually helped to develop and has gone on, unfortunately, without us. And it was more important, in my view, in fact, as a security contribution than it was perhaps in economic or trade, although there were important elements in that regard. So that's the pre-conflict. You get into a crisis. Obviously, diplomacy is absolutely crucial there as well. And we've seen the role, again, of our Secretary of State in the shuttle diplomacy throughout the Middle East, trying to help figure out how Gaza can be administered after the destruction of Hamas and the dismantling of the Hamas political wing. And then in the conduct of war, actually, again, the campaign in Iraq was a civil military campaign plan. We had a combination. It was written not just by the multinational force and our planners, it was also integrated with that of the embassy. And both the ambassador and I signed that particular plan. I remember, in fact, there was a little bit of eyebrow raising in the Pentagon about all the quote civilian crap that was in it. And, I had to explain that this is not a military plan, it is a civil military one. And that's the way it should be approached whenever you can. If you have a US led effort, that is clearly the desired approach. So that's how I think I would answer that. And again, it would have to be all of the above, and that diplomacy and force are working hand in glove. As I think it was General Shalikashvili who said that force with or diplomacy without force is like baseball without a bat, but it goes the other way as well.
Our next question is from Laurel Atkinson, who asks, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has said global climate change is the greatest threat facing the world. How then can standard U.S. foreign policy, i.e. military deterrence by America, be justified anymore given the intractable nature of wars today? Indeed, isn't the preservation of civilization today subject to our ability to stop and prevent wars?
Well, first of all, I understand the impulse, I guess, or the reason why one might say what Defense Secretary Austin said, noting that I was privileged to serve with him several times over the years, and two of those were in combat, especially when he was the operational commander during the second part of the surge in Iraq. I'm not sure, however, that I'd totally embrace the idea that climate change is the greatest threat. It clearly is one of the greatest threats to our world, without question. We see the evidence of that, the manifestations of climate change, the results of global warming that has taken place already. I mentioned some of those, desertification, but also you obviously have much more extreme weather events and much more numerous weather events. The once in a century storm is once every few years now, it seems. Again, the enormous forest fires, the intensity of so much of these different events has dramatically increased. That said, clearly, conflict between the world's two superpowers, I think, is a much more pressing and challenging issue, and again, one that has to be deterred. That has to be, I think, the foremost objective and focus of our Department of Defense, and indeed of the US government and the governments of our allies and partners. And there are obviously these other plates that I mentioned that have to be kept spinning, noting that climate change in the manifestations of it clearly are plates that have to be kept spinning as well. And we need to intensify our efforts to achieve the goals that have been set out to limit the amount of global warming that does take place, given how substantial the implications of that are for various parts of the world.
I think we have time for one more question, and this one comes from Francesca Roan, who asks, how do you balance deterrence with ensuring the protection of troops, especially when dealing with provocations like the ones that are occurring in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, this is where it's very helpful to have military to military communications, which seems to be one of the achievements of what was otherwise a pretty modest number of achievements in the talks between President Xi and President Biden. The first, of course, in a year, and that was very worrisome. The idea that the folks in the Pentagon could pick up the hotline and no one answers in Beijing is obviously not encouraging. And that was the case when the Chinese spy balloon floated across the United States. So we need to get, as the term goes, guardrails on this relationship, a floor in the relationship, noting, yes, it is a severe competition, in the words of the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, but we have to make very sure that that does not erupt into conflict. And trying to get some guidelines on to prevent incidents at sea or in the air is really quite important, so that a tactical event doesn't have untoward strategic implications. That's true of conflict all the time, by the way. It was true in the battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan. We often used to talk about the strategic sergeant and the strategic lieutenant, whose actions at a tactical level in tactical operations, especially if they go wrong in some significant way, can have huge strategic implications. And so there has to be a keen awareness about that. It's also at play, by the way, in the Gulf on a number of occasions, in the Middle East, between Iranian and U.S. Ships and drones and other capabilities out there. And there has to be an awareness all the way down to the individual soldier, the individual maritime ship's captain, and so forth, about what can go wrong, and an awareness and a determination to try to avoid that without, again, being less than firm in the response. So, but this is the essence of what it is that we're doing in the South China Sea. It's part and parcel of the most important mission that we have, as I've noted several times, which is to ensure that the elements of deterrence are rock solid, the capabilities of our forces as seen by a potential adversary, and our willingness to employ them as perceived by the potential adversary as well. And with that, let me thank you for guiding this very nicely. Thanks again to Fred Kemp and the Atlantic Council team for the opportunity to do this.
Fantastic. General Petraeus, if you don't mind, I actually miscalculated. We have just under 3.5 minutes left in our conversation. I wonder if I can squeeze in one more very specific question, which is from Albert Lee with Korea Pro, who asks, how can Israel be able to meaningfully prevent Hamas from reconstituting as long as Hamas's most senior leaders remain in Qatar and other nations and not Gaza?
Well, these public-facing leaders, particularly Hania, the multi-billionaire in a beautiful villa in Qatar, are, again, the outwardly facing individuals, if you will. They're accessible. They can be interviewed by The Economist and others, mouthpieces, but they are not the individuals who were administering Gaza, nor were they the leaders of the military wing, the extremist element that is essentially the army of terrorist fighters that comprise the Hamas military structure. And when those are destroyed and dismantled, what do you do in Qatar if you're not back in Gaza and you're particular extremist entity is no longer governing, in quotes, and also no longer threatening Israel. The real answer to the question, though, is how do you have the intelligence apparatus? How do you keep an eye, a very, very careful eye, on attempts by remnants of Hamas? And I should also note the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the junior partner of Hamas, and another extremist group that has taken part in these various activities. How do you keep them from being able to reassemble, to reestablish their capabilities to try to take over Gaza one more time? And this is why I've highlighted really the importance of making sure that Hamas cannot reconstitute. Again, if you have concluded that Hamas is akin to the Islamic State, and they have, and I think that is correct, then you have to do what we are helping the Iraqis and the Syrian democratic forces do in those respective locations, which is to keep an eye and pressure on the Islamic State. So yes, there still will be remnants. They'll still occasionally carry out insurgent and terrorist activities, and we should expect to see some of that by Hamas. But the Israelis will have to ensure that they can never reassemble the kind of capability that we saw on 10/7 that carried out what was a very sophisticated air, land, sea, even cyberspace operation that took advantage of enormous surprise that had fed disinformation into the intelligence systems and apparatuses of Shin Bet and the other services in Israel. And we're able to, by doing all of this, to conceive, train, equip, rehearse, and then execute a barbaric set of essentially unspeakable actions against largely innocent Israelis, and to kill some 1,200 of them and wound many thousand more. And so keeping a very, very close eye and enormous pressure on them is going to be a formidable task. It's particularly formidable if you're not going to have a presence in Gaza, which is what leads me to believe that probably inescapably there is going to have to be some presence there that was not there in the past. Because keep in mind that Gaza, in many respects, was a bit of a denied area, as you say, in the intelligence world, compared with, of course, say the West Bank, where there is a much greater presence of all kinds of different sources, methods, and security elements that enable the Israelis to keep an eye on the situation there.
Fascinating conversation. Really proves the thesis of your point that we can look to conflicts of the past to inform those of the present and indeed the future. General Petraeus, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to The Atlantic for arranging this conversation today. And thanks to all of you for tuning in.
Thanks, Ali.